So rather than hard coding the values that we're going to look for, what we're going to do is create a dynamic component which will accept a generic value, search for it, replace it within the text that it finds, and then pass out that value. This can then be used multiple times, and different information can be passed into the component to get the required information back out. So we already have our full text that's been extracted into our array of details. As we loop through our array of details, rather than looking specifically for client ID, let's pass in an argument which is going to search for a particular value. So let's change this to in_search field and create an argument called inSearch field. And let's enter client ID temporarily into the default value for our search field. Don't forget the colon. And as we're making our component generic, we don't want to have specific names for our arguments out. We want to have a generic name such as out found value. Great. So if our item contains our inSearch field, which in this case is still client ID, rather than assigning out customer ID, which no longer exists, we're going to assign out found value. And rather than replacing client ID, we're going to replace the inSearch field value. So we're doing exactly the same thing, but this time we're using generic arguments rather than hard-coded values. This means that in a second we can do exactly the same thing for customer name and customer country. Finally, in our message box, we're going to have returned value is and our out found value text. Let's quickly run it, make sure it's all working fine. Of course, we get exactly the same value as we did before, but if we quickly change this to customer name, we get the customer name returned rather than the client ID. Great. So let's go to the process and invoke that 3 times to get all of the pieces of information that we're looking for. Let's quickly create a sequence to disable the previous activities because we don't need those for the time being. Rename it something sensible. Disable the activity. And let's invoke our new component, extract work item details. Click import arguments. So first of all, we want to search for client ID. We're going to return this into a new variable in our process layer called str client ID. We're going to do exactly the same thing for client name and client country. Control K to create the new variable. Finally, let's create a message box detailing all the information that's been extracted. So, client ID is and str client ID, and then don't forget that we need to have a space in our text. Client name is and str client name, client country, client country. One last thing, let's make sure that the message box is removed from the component itself. We don't need that. Let's run the process, see which results we get. Great, so client ID, client name and client country are all populated perfectly. We're just using one component here and passing different information into it each time and getting different information out. This is much better than having one component which only ever works in one instance. Before we go any further, we've started to see that our components are starting to take a common theme. The key activities that should be contained within components are log messages, checks to see whether arguments are correct or not, potentially checks to see whether we're on the right screen or not, and then perform some set of actions. Let's go ahead and create a common template that we can use for every single component. It's much better to have information in a component and delete it rather than have to create it from scratch every time. To do this, let's copy our generic filter data table component, as this component contains most of the activities that we mentioned. In File Explorer, navigate to the generic folder, copy generic filter data table, and we're going to put this component in the top layer. Let's rename it and call it component template. Back in UiPath in the project pane, let's refresh and let's open up our component template. We want this component template to be completely generic, and we only want to make minimal changes to it each time we create a new component. So, for our in arguments, we're most likely to have string values. Let's have a new argument called argument1. Change it to string type, and do the same for the argument out. This time we'll call it argument2. Because the argument1 is not a data table, we're going to perform a string activity, string.isNull or empty, and our in argument1 value. We're going to keep a blank exception message, which we can amend each time we need to create a new exception. And the log message is also going to be made generic. Let's say argument1 value is, and in argument1. The next thing we might want to do is check if we're on a specific screen. To do this, we'll use an element exists. Drag it onto the screen. We don't need to indicate anything on the screen at this point, but we do need to create a variable, something generic like boolean or bool for short, and screen exists. Following the element exists, we actually need to check what that value was and throw an exception if there was an error. So if bool screen exists equals false, then throw an exception. It's always good to throw the exception in the negative, because if you threw this in the positive, all of your remaining activities would have to be held within the if statement. This way, we throw the exception, and if we don't throw the exception, we can just continue the component as normal. In the error message, we're going to put new exception. Correct screen was not found. And in the right-hand side, we're going to have a simple log message to say that the screen was found successfully. Of course, you can change these messages if you would like to make them more specific, but at least at this point, we don't have to make a change. Let's also change our str component name variable to something more generic. Let's put some parentheses and say enter component name here. So if we see this in our log messages, we'll know that we need to update that variable. We can delete this assign. We can delete the log message. We can leave a blank space for where we perform our actions. Another thing that's nice to do is to put a comment box at the top. Let's have this above the component. And let's just say enter information about the component here. You may want to put in information about the arguments that are coming in, where they've come from. You may want to put information about the screens that you're working with, the applications that you're working with, or even some information about people that can help you if there's problems with this particular component or application. Let's do a little bit of tidying up by using some sequences and naming them nicely. So first of all, we're checking arguments. Next, we're checking the correct screen. And then finally, we're going to perform some actions. Another useful and frequent check might be to check the file path. So let's put another sequence in. Check file path exists. Then we're going to select a path exists activity. Then we're going to create a new argument called inFilePath. Temporarily put in a fake file path, something like c/temp. test.xlsx. And in the path text, use our in_filePath argument. In the output exists property, Control K, let's use a Boolean value for path exists, and quickly create another if statement. If bool path exists equals false, let's throw an exception. New exception, and then file could not be found at. If we enter the expected location of our file, it'll help anyone to debug exactly where the file was expected to be. Again, quickly let's just log on the right hand side that the file was found successfully. Again, helping to speed up any debugging down the line. Once we've performed our actions, the final check we can do is a check on any argument that's being passed out. Once again, just to make sure that the value being passed out is the value that was expected. And as mentioned, all of these things can be deleted quite quickly. So if you don't need them, simply delete them later on. Make sure you quickly update the exception message if needed. Change this value to out argument 2. Of course, we won't be calling them argument 1 and argument 2, but once the argument values are updated in the arguments pane, the argument names will be updated automatically. Cool, so we have our component template, and this should be our starting point for any new components from now on.